They buried the twins in empty coffins. Weeks later they spoke. From a crate, buried in a sealed root cellar, lined with hymnal pages and stinking of oil and burnt lace, the sheriff thought they'd fallen into a sinkhole. The county physician knew better when he saw the bit still wedged in one child's jaw. In a town lit by lanterns and ruled by scripture, no one expected science to be the one left speechless. What truth forces two girls to speak only after death? If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The morning air hung thick with September dew as Elsie and Eunice Barker stood at the edge of their yard, tin pails swinging from thin arms. Their matching cotton dresses, faded to a ghostly blue, caught the early light. Neither girl wore shoes, their feet already mud-stained from the walk across the wet grass. From his spot by the woodpile, Emory Barker's axe rose and fell in an uneven rhythm. The leather harness that held his stump creaked with each swing, the sound carrying across the quiet yard. He didn't look up as the girls passed, though his shoulders tensed at the soft pad of their bare feet. On the porch, Lenora Barker sat rigid in her chair, a well-worn hymnal open on her lap. Her eyes followed the twins as they moved toward the tree line, her lips moving in silent prayer. The pages of her book fluttered in the morning breeze, but her grip remained steady. "Mind the sinkhole," she called out, her voice sharp as a bell. "Keep to the berry patch by Thompson's fence." Neither child responded. They walked in perfect step, their wet hair combed straight and dark against their backs. The woods swallowed them whole. By dusk, the tin pails hadn't returned. Lenora stood at the edge of the yard, one hand shading her eyes as she peered into the deepening shadows. The dinner bell rang 3 times, its echo dying in the heavy air. "They've gone toward Delaney," she told the first neighbors who arrived, wringing her hands in her apron. "I warned them, but children never listen." Her voice cracked just once when Reverend McLean touched her shoulder. Sheriff McClintock arrived at first light the next morning, leading 6 men on horseback. The fog lay thick in the hollows, turning familiar landmarks into pale ghosts. They spread out along the ridge, calling names that the wind scattered. Elsie. Eunice. The limestone outcroppings near Delaney Sinkhole stood silent, wet with dew and morning mist. McClintock dismounted, studying the ground with practiced eyes. The recent rains had turned the paths to mud, but no small footprints marked the earth. No scraps of cotton caught on thorns. No tin pails gleamed in the underbrush. "Wind's wrong," muttered Deputy Collins, pulling his coat tighter, coming from all directions at once. McClintock made careful notes in his leather-bound log, his handwriting precise despite the chill. September 27th, 1869. Dawn search of Delaney Sinkhole area. No footprints, no fabric, no calls returned. Wind odd. By Tuesday, hope had drained from the search like water through limestone. Lenora received visitors in her parlor, her back straight as a rail, her hands folded over her hymnal. When Reverend McLean suggested a memorial service, she wept. A single, sharp sob that she quickly stifled with her handkerchief. "We'll need graves," she said, her voice steady once more. "At Grace Hollow, where decent folk rest." Sheriff McClintock closed his notebook that afternoon, the case settling into his stack of unsolved mysteries. 2 empty coffins were ordered from the carpenter in Waterville, their pine boxes smelling of fresh-cut wood and finality. Dr. Harmon's buggy arrived 2 days later, wheels clattering on the rutted road to Grace Hollow. He clutched his medical bag with white-knuckled hands, demanding to see the graves while they were still fresh. Frost crackled under Dr. Harmon's boots as he made his way through Grace Hollow Cemetery that Thursday morning. His medical satchel, worn at the corners and heavy with papers, swung against his hip. The September air bit through his coat, unusually sharp for the season. The twin graves lay fresh near the eastern fence, their dirt still loose and dark against the gray grass. No headstones yet marked the spots, just wooden crosses with rough-carved initials. E.B. and E.B. Sheriff McClintock stood waiting, his gray wool coat buttoned tight against the chill. Behind him, Lenora Barker's black dress seemed to absorb what little warmth the morning offered. She clutched her prayer book like a shield. "I need to examine the bodies," Harmon said, pulling his ledger from the satchel. The pages fell open to his August notes, the ink still crisp. "These girls were in my care 6 weeks ago. There were injuries that require explanation." McClintock shifted his weight, boots creaking. "They were buried Tuesday, Doctor. Sealed pine coffins, as is proper. Then we'll need to exhume." Harmon's finger traced his own careful handwriting. August 12th. Patient Elsie Barker presents with circular bruising on both wrists, consistent with rope or leather restraint. Patient Eunice Barker shows extensive oral lesions and dental erosion. "You overstepped yourself, Doctor." Lenora's voice cut through the morning air. "My daughters rest in consecrated ground. I won't have you disturbing their peace with wild accusations." Harmon turned to McClintock, holding out his notes. "Sheriff, these injuries weren't natural. No death certificate was filed. No coroner examined the bodies. The law requires a warrant." McClintock interrupted, though his eyes lingered on the medical notes. "And proper cause. Without bodies, without evidence of foul play." "The evidence is in my ledger," Harmon insisted, "and in those coffins. You will not touch my children." Lenora stepped forward, her shadow falling across the fresh graves. "The Lord called them home. That's all any decent person needs to know." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Doctor, without a proper documentation from the county." "I understand." Harmon snapped his ledger shut. The sound echoed against the headstones. "I'll seek that documentation immediately." Back in his office that evening, Harmon's pen scratched across official letterhead. "To the office of the Lycoming County Coroner. I formally request investigation into the irregular burial of Elsie and Eunice Barker, aged 9, at Grace Hollow Cemetery. No death certificates were filed. No official examination was performed. Previous medical records indicate concerning patterns of injury." The reply came a week later, a single line declining to investigate without material evidence of wrongdoing. Harmon's ledger entry that night read, "No death certificate filed. No coroner's inspection. Community obedient to a silence I cannot name." Friday morning found him at his desk again, addressing a fresh envelope to the medical examiner's board in Harrisburg. His letter detailed the August injuries, the hasty burials, the refused exhumation. He sealed it with red wax and walked it to the post himself. That night, Thomas Reed, whose farm bordered the Barkers' northern field, watched thin smoke rise from their root cellar through the evening fog. By morning, It was gone. The heavy October fog pressed close against Martha Daly's windows that Saturday morning. She'd risen early to feed her chickens when she noticed it. Thin gray smoke threading up from the Barkers' root cellar vent, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Martha pulled her shawl tight and crossed the damp field between their properties. The cellar doors lay shut, iron padlock gleaming with dew. A sour smell hung in the air like vinegar and wet ash. She knocked 3 times, Yat's rap echoing hollow against the wood. "Lenora? Are you there?" Her voice scattered in the mist. No answer came. The smoke continued its slow drift upward, disappearing into the pearled sky. Martha waited 5 more minutes, then hurried to find Sheriff McClintock. By mid-morning, the sheriff stood in the Barkers' yard, watching Lenora explain. She kept her hands folded at her waist, her prayer bonnet casting shadows across her face. "Emery was burning spoiled potatoes," she said. "The rot got into our winter stores. Better to cleanse with fire than risk spreading the taint." McClintock descended the cellar steps, lantern held high. The underground room smelled of earth and old vegetables. Straw scattered the packed dirt floor. Wooden crates lined the walls, their contents hidden beneath burlap. No char marks scored the beams. No ashes dusted the corners. "Show me where the burning was done," he said. "We cleared it all away," Lenora replied from the doorway. "Cleanliness is next to godliness, Sheriff." Dr. Harmon intercepted McClintock outside the Waterville Hotel that afternoon. The physician's thin frame practically vibrated with urgency. First irregular burials, now unexplained fires. Harmon pressed. "Surely that warrants deeper investigation." "The law requires evidence, Doctor. Not just questions." They found Emery Barker at the general store, purchasing salt and lamp oil. His empty sleeve was pinned neat against his side. When McClintock asked about the cellar fire, Emery's weather-lined face grew still. "God's work must be private," he muttered, then gathered his purchases and limped away. The next Sunday, the Barkers' usual pew sat empty. The general storekeeper noted their absence at his counter. Even the postal carrier remarked how their daily correspondence had ceased. No more letters to distant relatives or church publications. Monday morning brought heavy rain. Jacob Wells, driving his wagon north on Pine Creek Road, spotted the Barkers' cart, abandoned near the Teodatin trailhead. The cart, listed to one side, loaded with crates and burlap-wrapped bundles. The path ahead led deep into the gorge, where old logging trails wandered north toward the New York line. In his leather-bound day book, the blacksmith's apprentice made a final entry for the previous week, September 28th, 1869, sold to E. Barker, 1 iron bit, small size, suitable for colt or child. Payment received in full, 75 cents. The forge's warmth pushed back the autumn chill as Dr. Harmon stood in Amos Fry's blacksmith shop. Iron hooks and horseshoes lined the walls, their shadows dancing in the firelight. Fry wiped his hands on his leather apron, leaving dark smudges against the worn material. "Show me the entry again," Harmon said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Fry pulled out the leather-bound ledger, its pages stained with coal dust. His thick finger traced down to September 28th. "Right here, clear as day." The blacksmith tapped the page. "Emery Barker came in late afternoon. Wanted something small," he said, "for training purposes." Harmon leaned closer, squinting at the careful script. 1 iron bit, small size, suitable for colt or child, 75 cents. Did he say what it was for specifically? Fry shook his head. Wasn't talkative. More fidgety than usual, if you ask me. Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to walk in. And you're certain of the date? Had to mark it careful like, county tax assessor checks my books end of every month. Fry crossed his arms. That was the day those girls went missing, wasn't it? Harmon nodded, copying the entry into his own notebook with precise strokes. The connection was there, but would it be enough? An hour later, he found Sheriff McClintock at his desk in the courthouse, reviewing property disputes. Autumn light filtered through dusty windows as Harmon laid out his case. The timing can't be coincidence, Harmon insisted. A bit sized for a child's mouth, purchased the very day they vanished. And now Martha Daly's account of smoke from the cellar. McClintock rubbed his temples. What exactly are you suggesting, Doctor? I'm suggesting we reopen the investigation. Question the Barkers properly this time. Based on what evidence? We have no bodies, no witnesses to any crime. Just a legal purchase and some smoke that could have been potato rot, like they claimed. McClintock stood, adjusting his gun belt. The law requires more than suspicion. Then let me gather sworn statements. Build a proper case. McClintock hesitated, then nodded. Do what you need to. But don't stir up the town without cause. That afternoon, Harmon interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Barkers that week. Sarah Miller at the general store confirmed Lenora had bought 3 bars of lye soap, claiming she needed to scrub away impurity. The miller's wife remembered seeing the twins walking with empty pails, headed toward the ridge. Even the church sexton had noticed something odd. Lenora praying alone in the chapel, hours after services ended. By Wednesday evening, Harmon sat at his desk, transcribing the day's interviews. His medical journal lay open, its margins filled with careful notes. He sealed everything, the witness statements, ledger copies, and his formal complaint, into a thick envelope addressed to Judge Harrison Whitman in Williamsport. As he walked to the post office, the first few snowflakes began to fall. Frost crackled beneath Reverend Cordell's boots as he made his weekly circuit through Grace Hollow Cemetery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tilted headstones, their weathered faces catching the pale light. His breath formed clouds in the bitter air as he paused to straighten a fallen vase, brush leaves from a marble angel. At the Barker plot, something caught his eye. The family marker, a simple granite slab with crossed palms carved at its crown, had shifted. The earth around its base showed signs of movement, as if the ground itself were unsettled. Cordell knelt to examine the displacement, his arthritic fingers tracing the frost-rimmed edge. That's when he saw it. A child's glove, small and gray, frozen stiff against the stone's back face. The wool was matted with soil and something darker that made his hand tremble as he lifted it. The size matched what the twins had worn to services. By noon, Sheriff McClintock had assembled a second search party. 6 men this time, not 20 like before. They combed the ridge above Delaney's sinkhole, prodding frozen earth with iron rods. Dr. Harmon joined them, his medical bag hanging heavy at his side. But even his methodical grid pattern yielded nothing but dead leaves and false hopes. "Ground's too hard now," one of the deputies said, stamping his feet against the cold. "We could walk right over them and never know." McClintock ordered them to focus on drainage channels, anywhere the twins might have sought shelter. They found a rusted pail half buried in creek mud, but it could have belonged to anyone. By sunset, with temperatures dropping, he called off the search. That evening, Doctor. Harmon packed his worn leather satchel in the boarding house. His notes, pages of interviews, sketches of bruise patterns, copies of ledger entries, seemed to mock him from the desk. He'd done everything by the book, followed every proper channel. But the silence from officials in Williamsport spoke volumes. Winter settled over Pine Creek Gorge like a shroud. Rumors trickled in about the Barkers. Someone's cousin had seen them in Lancaster, selling tonics from a cart. Another claimed Lenora was teaching hymns at a girls' school near Mount Joy. None of the stories held water when McClintock investigated. The community drew inward as snow deepened. Mothers kept their children closer. The path past the Barker farm fell into disuse. Even the regular Sunday visits to Grace Hollow thinned, as if people feared what else might surface from the frozen ground. New Year's Day dawned clear and brutal cold. Sheriff McClintock sat at his desk, staring at the Barker file. 3 months of dead ends, contradictions, and whispered fears filled its pages. Dr. Harmon's letters, increasingly urgent, increasingly detailed, remained unanswered in the county seat. Without bodies, without confession, without clear evidence of any crime, the law's hands were tied. With mechanical precision, McClintock wrote the date across the file's cover, January 1st, 1870. Below it, in his careful hand, investigation, suspended pending new evidence. The ink seemed to freeze as it dried. He placed the file in his bottom drawer, turned the key, and walked out into the bitter winter morning. Behind him, the office stood silent, holding its secrets like the frozen earth above Grace Hollow. Althea Rose's lantern cast dancing shadows across the root cellar's earthen walls. The air hung thick with mineral dampness and something else. A cloying sweetness that reminded her of the back room at her father's chandlery. Oil and iron, she thought, adjusting her shawl against the underground chill. She'd come seeking preserves, having heard the Barkers left in haste 6 weeks prior. The millwright's widow, her boarding mistress, insisted such scavenging was perfectly acceptable once a property stood empty. Still, Althea's hands trembled as she lifted the iron ring of the cellar door. Wooden shelves lined the walls, mostly bare save for dust-covered jars and broken crockery. The packed dirt floor showed signs of recent traffic, boot prints pressed into the stubborn clay, newer than the abandonment would suggest. Near the back wall, where the ceiling dropped low, a patch of scattered hay caught her eye. "There's something," she muttered, crouching to brush aside the loose stems. Her fingers met clay-packed straw, carefully arranged but clearly disturbed. The lantern's flame wavered as she cleared more debris, revealing the corner of a wooden crate. The box was roughly the size of a hope chest, its edges darkened as if by fire. Wire bound it, shut, wrapped in tight crosses that bit into the wood. When she touched the surface, warmth radiated through her gloves. Impossible in the cellar's winter chill. Althea straightened, heart pounding. She should fetch the sheriff. But curiosity, that same drive that made her question everything from scripture to school board policy, rooted her in place. The wire had been twisted off and reapplied. Someone had opened this recently. With trembling fingers, she unwound the binding. The lid resisted, then lifted with a soft sucking sound. The lantern's light fell across 2 small figures seated upright, facing each other like horrible dolls at a tea party. Their skeletal hands were interlocked, brittle fingers braided together. Identical faded muslin dresses hung from their frames. Dark hair, still partially intact, cascaded over hollow eye sockets. Their teeth, what remained of them, showed deep cracks and stains. The crate's interior walls were lined with paper, torn hymnal pages, their edges curled and saturated with oil. A blackened match lay between their feet. One skull lolled forward, jaw stretched wide by a rusted iron bit still locked between her teeth. Althea stumbled backward, her lantern clattering to the ground. She fled up the cellar steps, retching in the morning sun. Her screams brought neighbors running from the millwright's house. Sheriff McClintock arrived within hours, his expression grim as deputies cordoned off the cellar. He questioned Althea twice, making her trace every step, every touch. By sunset, they'd carefully removed the crate and its contents, wrapping it in oiled canvas for transport. The next morning, they brought it to Dr. Harmon's house on the outskirts of Jersey Shore. The physician, now bedridden with consumption, insisted on examining the remains himself. His hands shook as he lifted each small skull, fingers tracing familiar patterns of damage. "The Barker twins," he whispered, voice rough with certainty and grief. "Elsie and Eunice." He reached for his medical journal, determined to record one final set of observations before the consumption took him. Frost rimmed the headstones at Grace Hollow Cemetery as the second funeral for the Barker twins began. 2 pine coffins, no longer empty, rested beside fresh-dug holes that had taken 3 men with picks to carve through the frozen earth. The ground surrendered reluctantly, yielding only 2 inches before turning hard as iron. Reverend Cordell stood silent, his prayer book closed. The gathered mourners, mostly curious townspeople who'd never spoken to the twins in life, huddled against the morning wind. Sheriff McClintock's deputies kept watch from their horses, scanning the tree line for any sign of the missing parents. Dr. Harmon sat in a borrowed wheelchair, wrapped in wool blankets, his medical satchel clutched to his chest. The consumption had left him skeletal, but his eyes remained sharp as he watched the coffins lower. He'd insisted on attending before departing for Williamsport to give testimony. By afternoon, Harmon sat before Magistrate Charles Webb in the county courthouse, his voice weak but determined as he detailed his findings. He spread his August medical notes across the magistrate's desk with trembling hands. The bruising followed specific patterns, Harmon explained, pointing to his anatomical sketches. Circular marks on their wrists and ankles, consistent with rope burns, dental erosion suggesting frequent gagging. And here, he tapped the page, throat inflammation in both girls, likely from forced silence or screaming. The magistrate called additional witnesses. Sarah Whitmore, who'd sewn for the Barkers, described Lenora's growing religious mania. She'd make them recite hymns for hours, claiming their voices harbored Satan's whisper. If they spoke out of turn, she'd force lye soap in their mouths. Thomas Reed, the postal carrier, recalled finding torn hymnal pages scattered along the berry path weeks before the disappearance. Mrs. Barker said the wind took them, but they were soaked in something slick. Smelled like lamp oil. By evening, the magistrate had ordered Emery's military records unsealed. The documents painted a troubling picture. Mental instability noted by field surgeons, disciplinary actions for erratic behavior. eventual dismissal as unfit for command. His commanding officer had written, "Cannot be trusted with men's lives after Chancellorsville." Sheriff McClintock worked through the night, drafting wanted circulars for county printers. The descriptions were precise. Emery Barker, one-armed veteran, 42 years old, traveling with wife Lenora, 39, severe in dress and manner, last seen heading south with a peddler's cart. 3 days later, on March 10th, a boy named William Cooper spotted a familiar sight in Harrisburg's Market Square. A one-armed man sold tonics from a cart, while two thin girls in matching dresses stood silent beside him. Their hair hung straight and dark, their eyes fixed on the cobblestones. They looked just like the Barker twins, William told his father that evening, but different somehow, like dolls wearing their clothes. The boy's steady hand and keen eye would prove crucial. His detailed sketch, showing two girls with hollow cheeks and vacant stares, would appear in the Evening Telegraph's March 12th edition. But on that Thursday morning, as William described the strange girls to his father, the tonic seller's cart was already creaking south toward Lancaster. Circuit Judge Theodore Blackwood's breakfast at the Harrisburg Hotel was interrupted by the morning edition of the Evening Telegraph. His coffee grew cold as he studied the boy's sketch. Two identical girls with downcast eyes standing beside a merchant's cart. The likeness stirred something in his memory, a case file that had crossed his desk weeks earlier, bearing Dr. Harmon's urgent scrawl. "Boy," he called to the paper carrier, "when was this drawn?" "Thursday past, sir." Market day. Blackwood left his meal half-finished and hurried to the telegraph office on Market Street. The operator's fingers clattered across the brass key, sending urgent dots and dashes northward. Twins matching. Barker description seen Harrisburg, stop heading south. With one-armed man, stop immediate action required, stop. But nature had other plans. Near Trout Run, where the telegraph line crossed Lycoming Creek, a fierce late-winter storm had torn through the valley. Ice-laden branches crashed onto the copper wires, severing the connection just as the message began its journey. The operator in Cedar Run would receive nothing but static. For 2 crucial days, the warning sat trapped in broken wire and fallen timber. When line crews finally restored service on Monday morning, Sheriff McClintock assembled a posse within the hour. They rode hard for Harrisburg, but the Barkers' trail had already grown cold. At the farmer's market, vendors remembered the strange medicine seller and his silent companions. "Headed south," said a cooper who'd sold them a water barrel. "Had 2 mules that didn't match, one dappled gray, other brown with a white sock. Cart needed work on the left wheel, made an awful sound." McClintock followed the canal towpath, where lock-keepers confirmed seeing such a mismatched team pass through. The trail led to Lancaster, where a breakthrough finally came, but not the one they'd hoped for. The twins weren't Elsie and Eunice at all. They were orphans from the Lancaster County almshouse, selected for their similar builds and dark hair. The girls, Mary Collins and Sarah Weber, both 11, told of being offered food and pennies to stay quiet and wear the Barkers' old dresses. They were to answer only to girl and never speak unless spoken to. Mrs. Barker said if we made a sound, she'd feed us lye like the others. Mary whispered to the matron who found them hiding in the almshouse washroom. Said we'd end up in the box, too. The circuit court quickly declared the girls victims rather than accomplices. They were returned to the almshouse's care, where the matron noted they refused to wear matching clothes and wouldn't let anyone brush their hair straight down. On March 15th, as McClintock prepared to expand the search, a letter arrived at his office from Reverend James Whitfield of Mount Joy Presbyterian. The preacher had recognized something peculiar about one of the false twins, a silver ring she wore on a leather cord around her neck. In the spring of 1866, Whitfield wrote, "I blessed 2 identical rings for the Barker twins' baptism. I remember distinctly engraving them myself, EEB, for Elsie Elizabeth and Eunice Eleanor. The ring I saw in Lancaster bears those very marks, though tarnished now with what looks like ash." The letter concluded with a postscript. Whitfield had convinced the girl to surrender the ring, which he was sending by secure post to the Lycoming County Courthouse. The package arrived at the Williamsport Courthouse wrapped in brown paper and sealed with red wax. Sheriff McClintock's hands trembled slightly as he cut the twine. Inside, cushioned in cotton wool, lay a small silver ring, its surface dulled by what appeared to be dark residue. Dr. Harmon, propped up in his sickbed at the Jersey Shore Inn, held the ring close to his spectacles. Despite his failing health, his fingers remained steady as he traced the inscription. EEB. The lettering matched perfectly with the flourished script he'd seen in Lenora's family Bible. The same distinctive curve to the E, the same deep pressing of the tool. "This is Lenora's hand," he confirmed, voice barely above a whisper. "She carved these herself, not the preacher. Look how the second E cuts deeper, like she was pressing harder with each letter." He pulled out his medical ledger, comparing the inscription to notes he'd made about the twins' injuries. The same forceful hand that wrote their names in my register. McClintock gathered 2 witnesses, Benjamin Wade, the blacksmith who'd sold the bit, and Martha Daly, who'd seen the smoke from the root cellar. They departed for Mount Joy that afternoon, their horses' hooves clattering on the frozen mud of the Lancaster Pike. They found the Barkers in a hayloft above Weaver's copperage, where Emery had been trading his healing tonics for lodging. The arrest was swift. Emery offered no resistance, his remaining arm hanging limp at his side as deputies led him down the ladder. But Lenora's composure shattered when she saw the ring in McClintock's hand. "The fire didn't cleanse them," she shrieked, lunging at the sheriff. Their whispers poisoned the air. The Lord demanded silence. 2 deputies restrained her as she thrashed, her prayer bonnet falling away to reveal wild eyes and unkempt hair. They wouldn't stop speaking in tongues. We had to seal their voices in flame. The orphan girls, Mary and Sarah, were found huddled behind stacked barrels, wearing identical gray dresses that had belonged to the twins. The local Presbyterian church took them into protective custody, where they gradually began speaking again, though never about what they'd witnessed in their time with the Barkers. Back in Jersey Shore, Dr. Harmon's condition worsened. The winter's investigations had taken their toll on his aged frame, and pneumonia had settled deep in his lungs. On March 20th, knowing he wouldn't live to testify, he called for a court clerk and dictated his final statement. For 6 hours, he spoke in detail of every injury he'd documented, every conversation with the twins, every suspicious interaction with Lenora. He described the strange silence that had fallen over the girls in their final weeks, the raw marks around their mouths, the terror in their eyes when their mother spoke of purification. Let it be known, he concluded, his voice failing, that these children suffered grievously under a doctrine of silence. He signed the document with a trembling hand and had it sealed in the presence of 3 witnesses. The following morning, March 21st, Dr. Elijah Harmon was found dead in his bed, his medical ledger clutched to his chest, open to the page where he'd first recorded the twins' injuries. The Williamsport jailhouse smelled of coal smoke and damp limestone. Aldous Bell, the court clerk, arranged his writing materials on the scarred wooden table, fresh foolscap paper, 2 sharpened pencils, and a small bottle of ink. Across from him, separated by iron bars, Lenora Barker sat perfectly straight in her cell, her prayer bonnet still impeccably pinned despite 3 days of confinement. "Begin with the morning they disappeared," Sheriff McClintock instructed, standing in the corner. His pocket watch ticked loudly in the stone-walled silence. Lenora's voice emerged clear and measured, as if reciting from memory. They had been speaking in their secret language again. Not the playful babbling of children, but something older, something that echoed in the rafters at night. She folded her hands in her lap, the iron manacles clinking softly. "The Lord showed me it was Satan's tongue." Bell's pencil scratched across the paper, capturing every word. The confession continued for hours, Lenora describing elaborate rituals of purification, forcing the girls to recite hymns until their voices grew hoarse, binding their hands when they tried to sign to each other, withholding food when they whispered at night. "One mouth for 2 minds," she explained, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "That's how the devil works. He splits the soul between bodies, lets them share thoughts no mother can hear." She described watching the twins through knotholes, catching fragments of their private language, words that made the milk curdle and the crops wither in the ground. On the 2nd day, Lenora spoke of the cleansing. Her voice remained steady as she detailed how they'd prepared the root cellar, lining the crate with hymnal pages soaked in lamp oil. The sacred words would contain their corruption, she said. We had to seal their voices before they could spread their poison to other children. Belle filled page after page with her testimony. She spoke of Emery's reluctance, how she'd convinced him it was God's will, how they'd waited until the girls were asleep before carrying them to the cellar. The iron bit, she explained, was to lock away the devil's tongue. But it was her account of other twins that most disturbed the clerk. Lenora described traveling to neighboring counties, seeking out families with twin children. She claimed to recognize the mark, pairs who shared secret languages, who moved in mirror patterns, who seemed to know each other's thoughts. God sent me to find them all, she said, to silence every double voice. On Sunday morning, Bell arrived to find his transcription cabinet forced open. 4 pages were missing, the section where Lenora had named specific families and locations, including details about twins from Union County who allegedly spoke with one mind through 2 throats. Sheriff McClintock ordered an immediate search of the jailhouse, but the pages were never recovered. The remaining transcript was sealed in the courthouse vault, and preparations for the October trial began. McClintock himself rode out to interview families with twins across 3 counties, following the trail of Lenora's travels before the murders. On March 28th, He reached the Miller farm near Lamar. Sarah Miller, pale and hesitant, described how Lenora had appeared 5 years earlier, offering to cleanse her stillborn twins. "She took their bodies," Mrs. Miller whispered, "said she had to burn them proper, so their spirits wouldn't wander back wrong." Sarah Whitmore's hands trembled as she lifted the leather-bound ledger from her trunk. The midwife's careful script filled each page with birth records spanning 20 years in Slate Run. Sheriff McClintock stood beside her kitchen table, his shadow falling across the yellowed pages as she turned to December 1865. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry written in shaking letters, "The Henderson twins, born without breath at midnight." The sheriff leaned closer, reading aloud. "December 12th, 1865. Twin boys delivered stillborn to Margaret Henderson. Lenora Barker, present at birth, took possession of remains for Christian burial." He pulled out his notebook, and there was no burial. None recorded at Grace Hollow. Sarah confirmed, her finger tracing down the page. "I asked Reverend Cordell myself last week. No plots purchased, no service held." She paused at another entry. There were others. 3 more sets of twins that winter, all stillborn, all taken by Lenora. McClintock carried the ledger to Williamsport the next morning. In the courthouse, 12 jurors listened as the entries were read into record. On the 4th description, details of tiny bodies wrapped in muslin and carried away in Lenora's cart. One juror, a young father named Thomas Reed, slumped forward in his chair. The Philadelphia Inquirer sent a reporter that week. His dispatches appeared under the headline, "Twin Terror, Religious Fervor Leads to Cemetery Mystery." The stories spread across Pennsylvania, drawing crowds to the courthouse steps. Local children, despite their parents' warnings, began gathering at dusk near the abandoned Barker farm. The walls cry at night. 13-year-old William Foster told the sheriff after being caught inside the empty house, "Like babies whispering." 3 other boys confirmed his account, having broken in through a loose board over the kitchen window. They described strange scratches in the floorboards and a peculiar hollow sound when they knocked on the root cellar door. McClintock ordered the farm fully boarded up on April 15th. But the stories continued. Martha Daly, whose property adjoined the Barkers, reported hearing hymns late at night, though the house stood empty. Her youngest daughter began speaking of the twin voice, a term Lenora had used in her confession. The court depositions grew darker. Sarah Whitmore testified about Lenora's presence at difficult births, how she would whisper about double souls and vessels of corruption. 3 other midwives came forward with similar accounts. Their ledgers showed a pattern. Wherever Lenora appeared, stillborn twins vanished without burial. On May 1st, Amos Fry arrived at the courthouse carrying his Smithy's account book. The leather binding was cracked, the pages stained with coal dust, but the entry for September 28th, 1869, remained clear. 1 iron bit, small size, child, Colt, charged to E. Barker. Below the sale, Emery's shaky signature confirmed the purchase. Made the very day his daughters disappeared. Judge Walther examined the ledger carefully, then issued his order. The iron bit, still held in evidence, was to be cleaned and presented to the jury at trial. The courtroom fell silent as his words echoed against the high ceiling. Let them see the instrument that sealed these children's fate. In his cell, Emery Barker began to weep for the first time since his arrest. Frost painted the courthouse windows as people filed into the wooden benches. The air hung heavy with coal smoke from the potbelly stove in the corner. Sheriff McClintock stood beside the defendant's table, his hand resting near his pistol as Lenora Barker entered in iron shackles. She wore her black dress like armor, straight-backed and unwavering. Her prayer bonnet cast shadows across sharp cheekbones, and her lips moved in silent recitation. Beside her, Emery slumped in his chair, his remaining arm limp in his lap, eyes fixed on the scarred tabletop. Judge Walther's gavel cracked like splitting ice. The clerk read the charges: 2 counts of murder in the first degree against Lenora and Emery Barker in the deaths of Elsie and Eunice Barker. The prosecution began with Dr. Harmon's journal, read by his colleague, Dr. Matthews. The leather-bound book lay open, its pages yellow at the edges. August 15th, 1869. Examined E. and E. Barker, aged 9. Severe bruising on wrists and ankles. Torn tissue inside mouth, consistent with forced insertion of metal implement. Children refused to speak. Mother claims religious instruction requires silence. Reverend Cordell approached the stand next, holding the silver ring in trembling fingers. "I bless this at their baptism," he testified. "Engraved their initials myself. Found it on an orphan girl in Mount Joy, dressed to look like them." The blacksmith's ledger drew murmurs from the gallery. Amos Fry pointed to Emery's signature beneath the purchase of the iron bit. "Never sold one that small before," he said. Asked what it was for, he said, "Discipline." When Althea Rowe described discovering the crate, several jurors covered their mouths. She spoke of the oil-soaked hymnal pages, the wire bindings, the matched positioning of the remains. They were seated face to face, she said, like they were sharing secrets. The court clerk unfolded one preserved hymnal page, carefully lifting it with gloved hands. Written in the margin in Lenora's precise script: "Bind the tongue, break the voice, seal the whisper in sacred fire." Lenora's smile grew wider. "Tell us about the previous twins," the prosecutor demanded. "The Henderson boys in 65, the Miller girls in 66, all stillborn, all taken by you. Where are they buried?" "In earth made holy," Lenora replied, her voice clear as chapel bells, "where twin speech cannot corrupt." The testimony continued for 3 days. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds from the root cellar. The Lancaster orphanage matron described how Lenora had dressed abandoned children as copies of her dead daughters. Dr. Matthews presented Harmon's final statement, sealed before his death. "I have witnessed systematic torture disguised as religious instruction." The twins were silenced not by accident, but by design. On October 9th, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman's hands shook as he read, "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Lenora Barker, guilty." Lenora stood, chains rattling. "I saved them," she declared. "The twin voice is Satan's door." I sealed it shut. Emery never rose to hear his verdict. 2 days later, fever took him in his cell. His last words, recorded by the jailkeeper, were, "The war broke my compass, but she broke my soul." Snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the Williamsport jail yard. By first light, drifts had gathered against the fresh-built gallows, turning the raw pine white. The temperature hung at 12 degrees, cold enough that the hangman's rope had needed warming by the stove to maintain its flexibility. Inside her cell, Lenora Barker sat perfectly straight on her narrow cot, dressed in the same black dress she'd worn at trial. Her prayer bonnet was starched crisp, though her hands remained folded in her lap, unshackled. She had refused breakfast, asking only for her hymnal, which lay closed beside her. Sheriff McClintock approached the cell at 9:15. "It's time," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. Lenora rose smoothly, as if attending church. The guard detail, 4 men who had drawn the shortest straws, fell into formation around her. Their boots echoed on the iron stairs leading to the yard. A small crowd had gathered despite the weather. Most were officials, the county coroner, 2 judges, the court clerk, Aldous Bell with his leather portfolio, and 3 newspaper men stamping their feet against the cold. Dr. Matthews stood near the back, clutching Harmon's medical bag like a shield. Reverend Cordell stepped forward to offer last rites. Lenora turned her face away. At the base of the gallows steps, McClintock asked, as required by law, "Do you have any final words?" Lenora's voice carried clearly through the falling snow. "I only did what was needed." The official record notes the time of hanging as 10:11 a.m. The snow continued to fall. No family claimed the body. The prison cart carried her to the potter's field behind the jail, where she was buried without marker or ceremony. 3 weeks later, the Lancaster poorhouse reported 2 sets of orphan siblings, including the girls who had posed as the Barker twins, missing from their beds. Their few belongings remained untouched. The night watchman claimed to have seen nothing unusual. The preacher who had sheltered them received orders of transfer to a parish in Ohio the following Sunday. His wife told neighbors they were glad to go, though she wouldn't say why. On February 15th, Aldous Bell entered the courthouse looking ill. He placed his resignation letter on Judge Walter's desk with trembling hands. When pressed for explanation, he described discovering something in Lenora's former cell while collecting her few effects. "Scratched into the floorboards," he said, beneath where her cot had stood. The words. He paused, swallowing hard. They match exactly a passage from the missing pages of her confession. The ones that vanished, word for word. The judge demanded to see this inscription, but by the time guards escorted him to the cell, they found the relevant floorboards had been pried up and removed. Bell's resignation was accepted without further inquiry. He left town that night, leaving most of his belongings behind. The courthouse clerk who replaced him found Bell's portfolio wedged behind a filing cabinet. Inside was a single sheet of foolscap, covered in Bell's distinctive handwriting. The paper contained what appeared to be a copied portion of Lenora's missing confession. Water damage had rendered most of it illegible, save for one clear line that matched what Bell claimed to have found carved in her cell. The sheet was logged into evidence, then vanished from the courthouse files less than a week later. Its contents were never officially recorded. The courthouse maintenance worker who discovered the scratched message refused to enter cell 9 again. He'd been sweeping when his broom caught on the uneven floorboard, revealing letters carved deep into the wood. The voice returns if the ears remain open. By noon, 3 other workers had seen it. By sunset, the cell was sealed. Sheriff McClintock arrived with a carpenter to remove the marked boards, but found them already missing. Only splinters and nail holes remained. The night guard swore no one had entered, though he admitted to dozing briefly around midnight. His logbook showed no visitors. That Sunday, 50 miles north in Slate Run, Reverend Mitchell gripped his pulpit with white knuckles during morning service. His sermon, titled "On Duplicate Vessels," warned of children born too similar, of hollow mouths that echo each other. Half the congregation left before communion. Those who stayed noticed he avoided looking at the Warner sisters, identical twins who always sat in the third pew. The following Wednesday, in Pine Creek Township, Reverend Aldrich caused a scene by refusing to bless the newborn Keller twins. "I'll not mark what God hasn't fully separated," he told their mother, backing away from the font. He resigned his position that afternoon, leaving only a note. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." McClintock submitted his retirement papers on February 20th, a full 5 years before his pension would have matured. "There's a fatigue in the bones that sleep won't cure," he wrote to the county commissioner. His deputy found him that evening in his office, staring at Harmon's medical journals, his hands shaking too badly to turn the pages. The courthouse began an official inventory of the Barker case files on February 22nd. 3 archivists worked through the weekend, comparing document numbers against the registry. Their final report, delivered March 1st, confirmed what many had suspected. 4 pages of Lenora's jailhouse confession remained unaccounted for. The gap in pagination ran from pages 17 through 20. Upon closer examination of the binding thread, 3 of the missing sheets appeared to have been blank, the indentation of Aldous Bell's pen visible on adjacent pages, but no ink having transferred through. Only page 19 had contained actual text. Dr. Harmon had referenced it specifically in his final statement, noting a name circled twice in fresh ink. The page itself was never found. March arrived with unseasonable warmth. The snows melted early, revealing the unmarked earth above Lenora's prison grave. No grass would grow there that spring. Clara Witz pulled her shawl tighter as she catalogued the final documents from the Barker trial. The courthouse archive smelled of leather bindings and iron ink, dust motes dancing in weak sunlight through high windows. Her fingers, chapped from sorting papers all winter, brushed against something at the bottom of box 17. A cream-colored envelope sealed with now broken red wax. The envelope's torn edge revealed a fragment of parchment inside. Clara lifted it carefully, squinting at the faded script. One word stood out clearly: Merrick. Her hands trembled slightly as she consulted the county registry, tracing backwards through the entries until she found it. A birth record from 1860, partially scratched out with dark ink. Only the surname remained legible. Child Merrick, born June 9th, 1860. The entry had been struck through repeatedly, the paper nearly torn. The death notation simply read 1862, with no cause listed. No burial location was recorded. Clara pulled the land surveys next. The Barker tenant farm bordered the old Merrick homestead before Emery left for war. Both properties shared a well, according to tax records. More importantly, she found Eunice Barker's original birth registration, initially recorded under the name Merrick, before being amended in 1863. Her fingers shook as she opened the parish records. The baptismal entry for the twins listed them as Elsie and Eunice Barker. But the ink was fresher than the surrounding text, written in a different hand. Beneath it, she could just make out the ghost of earlier writing, scraped away. Sheriff McClintock arrived that afternoon, his boots leaving wet prints on the archive floor. Clara showed him her findings without comment. He studied the documents for a long time, his weathered face giving nothing away. "File it," he said finally. "Case is closed. Let the dead rest." Clara began to protest, but McClintock cut her off. "Some truths are better left buried, Miss Wits. Those girls suffered enough." She watched him leave, then carefully arranged the papers in their original order. The envelope with its torn edge went back into box 17. Within days, the story of the Barker twins began its transformation into whispered legend, a tale told around fires on winter nights, each telling slightly different from the last. Spring came early that year. March rains turned the cemetery grounds to mud. On the night of the first thunderstorm, lightning split the sky above Grace Hollow. The bolt struck true, cleaving the Barker headstone in two perfect halves. The following morning, Clara stood in the drizzle, watching Reverend Cordell examine the ruined marker. There, in the muddy crack between the broken stones, something glinted dully, a small silver ring, green with age. The same ring that had been blessed in 1866, its tiny inscription still visible, E.E.B. The Reverend turned it over in his palm, frowning. "This was buried with them," he said. "How did it get under the marker?" Clara said nothing, thinking of the scratched-out records and amended birth certificates, of a child named Merrick, born in 1860, who vanished from the books in 1862, of twin girls who appeared suddenly in 1863, with new names and a history that began exactly where another's had ended. She left the ring with Reverend Cordell and walked back through the morning mist, the wet grass soaking her skirts. Behind her, the broken headstone stood like an open mouth, its secrets finally falling silent.